John Barclay. John is a person who I've met virtually anyway, who has an inspiring story to tell, and not only an inspiring story, but one that fits right in to the logic of our life process program, in the sense that John has had hardships in his life, and he's had to think about how to incorporate those hardships into the present moment. Some things have given him setbacks, and he's had to figure out ways to move himself forward. He's stumbled into some periods of time that he would call addictions, phenomena he would call addictions in his life, both to drug-related involvements or alcohol-related involvements, but also non-drug, non-alcohol related involvements, which also fits right into our playbook for understanding what addiction is. And I think people will find that the way that he's ameliorated these things in his life, or the way that he's decided to incorporate them into a balanced lifestyle, comes exactly from what we try to teach people in the long term through our program, or help people see in themselves that there's no different world that exists where drugs and alcohol are at the center of things, and so you have to play by a different rule book. It's life, and we all have to figure out how to balance it. The other thing I'll say is that we at Life Process Program, we try to walk this razor's edge where we want to make sure people understand generally that addiction is a useful concept. The idea of saying that you have an addiction or experiencing an addiction is useful as a placeholder for something that we all understand more or less. We kind of know what it feels like to pursue something despite the downsides that it brings us, or the negative kickback that it brings us in our lives. And the idea that even though once we are aware of the fact that it's bringing us negative kickback, that we're still pursuing it. And, well, why am I doing that? And how do I fix this? So I'm going to let John speak for himself and maybe give himself a little bit of a better introduction than I could possibly do. John, thanks for coming on and talking with me.
Thanks for having me, Zach. I really appreciate us getting to share this conversation and be here together. So I have an interesting childhood. I'll start there, in that I have many different parents. I have legal parents, I have biological parents, I have step parents. And the funny part is that it's almost sort of a yin and yang situation, in that let's just call her my mother and my father got divorced when I was very young, and they both got remarried around the same time when I was about 6. Mom to my stepfather, dad to my stepmother. Both of them had 2 sons, which were both older than me. So it was kind of like this mirror type situation, where on the one side, I had a very loving, adventurous, amazing mom, and a father who had his own unresolved difficulties from his childhood, and sort of a stepmother who was abusive. And so I grew up at an early age spending Monday night with my mom, Tuesday night with my dad, Wednesday night with my mom, and kind of bouncing back and forth. And I had these sort of polar opposite experiences as I was aging. And I internalized from my dad's side of the family, I internalized a lot of sort of low self-esteem. So I would have all of these opportunities and wonderful experiences on my mom's, and my stepmother would like to kind of condemn those experiences at the dinner table. And whether it be from there or difficulties in school, which I also had, but I internalized this message that I was unlovable and not deserving of good things in life. And I felt like for a lot of my childhood, that kind of haunted me and painted this color over my experience in school, my experience with my friendships, and just difficulty in family dynamics. Zach, I'm wondering on your end, because I know that you work with kids, have you seen children kind of internalize, like take on too much, like something could be going on inside of their lives pertaining to maybe family dynamics or school, where they feel like it's somehow their fault, or they have a part to play in it, when really it's not so much that situation.
I think so. I'm really careful to not make assumptions,
Yeah.
and I mean that's a difficult thing to do because you have to form a basis for a relationship somewhere if you have a responsibility of scaffolding like a learning or developmental thing. So I
Mhm.
think that I probably do make assumptions, but I will say um, certainly there are kids who outright say to me, depending on the age, I guess. I work kindergarten through 12th grade, so it's a vast range, will outright say to me that they're confused about their identity. And this oftentimes comes before a natural state of development where kids are really, their emphasis is on figuring out their identity. That's like teen years.
Mhm.
I have third, fourth, fifth grade kids who have something similar to you, who say that they feel like it's a few different parallel lives that don't really, can't really, they can't coexist in their mind, if that's what you mean. So like at dad's house it's this one arrangement, at mom's house is this other arrangement, and there are expectations first of all from those separate households, different values that are expected of them that they're expected to live out. And on the other hand, there's also this idea of the tacit idea about who they're supposed to be or what they're capable of that play out differently depending on where they are. And it seems like there are trends. Then there's a third dimension of that, I should say, that at school it's all about the social environment and how you're able to contextualize yourself in the school community or your peer group. And sometimes that plays by a totally different set of rules. And depending on where those kids are in a given week, let's say they spend a week at one place, a week at the other, it seems like their ideas, their concerns, their way of being manifests differently, and not necessarily better or worse, but in some cases they're visibly in more distress. And when I've talked to people about that, when I've talked to kids about that, sometimes it's just that there's a certain overwhelm at one side or the other. Sometimes it's just trying to make these three different worlds exist, and they're kind of constantly or on and off in a sense of existential distress. Or sometimes they start to get used to whatever pattern emerges from living in one household versus the other, and the way that one household's values and everything else um, aligns with their experience at school and with friends in that network. It's just totally different depending on where they are, and that can be a confusing state. Hope I answered that well. Tried to be comprehensive.
Absolutely. Yeah. It explains kind of what I experienced very well. So I'll just give another example in my life. My mom was an avid traveler. She loved to travel and experience new cultures, and was really just one of her values was adventure. And that was also something that I really took a liking to at an early age. Now, so around every year we would plan to travel somewhere as a family. And for whatever reason, my stepmom really didn't like that. And so I kind of learned that it wasn't safe for me to communicate these adventures. And so I would know, for example, we would be traveling to some other country like a year in advance, but I would sort of lie through omission that whole year up until like a week before the vacation. And then be like, well, by the way, I'm going to be going here for this amount of time. And then I would get backlash. So I kind of learned at a very early age that it didn't feel safe to be myself and express things that I was excited about and was working towards, and that were manifesting in my life. And I also, just like you said, I kind of carried that feeling of like it not being safe into school with me. And that in third grade, um, I had an experience where I was assaulted by two kids on the first day of school at a new school. And so in addition to that, I sort of made a childhood vow to myself, I'm never going to put myself in that type of social situation again. And so I kind of went into recluse mode and would beg the teachers to like not make me go outside to recess. School was very challenging socially, in grade school at least. I did have friends, but most of them were kind of outside of school. and so I learned these ways of coping with the world and with life that were a challenge, and I think played into what later could be constituted as like my experience with addiction. I had a lot of pain that I didn't necessarily know how to cope and deal with in childhood, and I have memories of talking to my mom, who was kind of like my person growing up, about that, but not all that clearly. And she kind of knew about the dynamics at my dad's house, but I kept on having to go over there every other day. And that was definitely a challenge. I fast forward a little bit to high school, and when I was a sophomore in high school, that was when I discovered drugs for my first time. And I had never really, no one had ever really sat me down and talked about like drugs before. I didn't really know what they were, other than it was like, oh, those things are bad, don't do them. And I had gotten to a point where I was in so much pain and I was so lonely. And I remember having one friend in high school who, you know, we had become very close. We had done some traveling together, but he had started sort of drifting off to like the cool crowd and using cannabis. And I just got to a point where I decided that I would try it too. And it felt like, for the first time in my life, those feelings of, you know, inadequacy were gone. And it just felt like an escape. It felt like an escape into a different world where the issues that had plagued me for a long time kind of disappeared. And that was a relief. It was a relief. And at the same time, it also put a barrier in my life, because I had developed a really close relationship with my mom, but this was a point of contention in my relationship with her. She just didn't want me using drugs. And so someone who at first I had felt like was my best friend kind of wasn't my enemy, but it was this cat and mouse game of like, I'm gonna, you know, use eye drops and deodorant and try to play it off like, you know, I'm not intoxicated. And she would give me a hug that was really more of a sniff test. And so she also would,
a passive aggressive game of what are you up to?
yes. And that kind of closed in my world more. I don't know what I want to know some of your experiences with addiction in your life, and what maybe at a certain point you used a substance to try to, I don't know. I'll let you talk. I'd like to hear a little bit about your experience with that.
Okay. Can I roll back for just a
Yeah.
minute? Because something that really interested me about what you said was, and I have a follow up here. You mentioned you were in third grade, and so already you have these competing value sets, and an idea that you weren't even able to be excited about something like going on a family trip, because you knew that that was looked down upon in some sense by another faction of your family. And I could even imagine, I'm just putting words in your mouth now, so take them out if they don't fit, but I could even imagine that, bringing up the excitement for a trip, or that was just a good example, would be difficult to do with school, for fear that that would be relayed to the other side of your family. At least I've experienced that with some kids that I work with. And so you're already sort of in a mode of, you already have to figure out these skills for managing that communication at third grade. Third grade's very young. And the idea that someone should have those skills and utilize them appropriately for both for their own self-interest and preservation, but also in accordance with like social norms, that's crazy. And you kind of need mentorship in that situation. I've also noticed that, I've experienced things like that, and people are really quick to either give a label to that experience if they're seeing something as awry, or if you experience, you said you were recoiling, especially after there's like a bullying incident or
Yeah.
hazing, harassing kind of incident in third grade. I've seen this happen to people where they're not interested in having the, let's just say, guidance counselors or people who have an interest in kids' well-being will often have a half hour or an hour conversation with a student who seems to be in distress. And they don't get the full picture in that hour because maybe that person doesn't want to open up and say that I was picked on by two other kids. Or maybe they don't even have the words or the ability to articulate the family dynamics that you were able to do so well right now, sitting in front of me as an adult. And so they have to make some assumptions, like I was nervous about earlier. And sometimes those assumptions are whatever is in the existing box of tools. So I've seen labels like, either this person's like getting diagnosed. Why isn't he going out to recess? It's a complex. Why aren't they ever able to talk? It's a complex. And those labels can become self-fulfilling. So my question to you is that I'm curious about how that manifested in terms of the people at school who would be tasked with helping you. Did people see you as an outcast or some sort of a diagnostic label, or put words or the feelings in your mouth when they shouldn't have? And if so, did that experience map on to did that further your negative self-image?
Great questions. I don't really recollect like adult figures in school really stepping in that way, but I have been in therapy throughout my life, child therapists, and I have had certain labels attached to me throughout my life, depression, generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety, things like that, introversion, but I don't really remember tapping into that and bringing it in as part of my identity so much in childhood. And I really appreciate you reflecting back. Like, it was challenging to juggle those dynamics at my mom's house, dynamics at my dad's house, and in school. I'll add a little bit more context to the situation at my father's house. And this is only through my life experience of thinking about this that I'm able to talk about it now. My father was horrifically abused as a child, and he has had an aversion to therapy and really addressing that. And what he's done to kind of block it out is, you could call it workaholism. Very, very intelligent man, graduated from Caltech, electrical engineer in Silicon Valley, but he has spent the majority of his life, and still does, working. And the idea of meditation or kind of being quiet is very difficult for him, because I think, this is just my speculation, but I think that in that quietness, then the past starts to kind of come back into his thought patterns. And so as a kid, I also had this experience of like, why am I the last one at after school care? It's dark. Where is my dad? And he was trying to, get back from Silicon Valley. And so as a kid, I also internalized that as, oh, this has to do with me. There must be something wrong with me where my dad didn't want to spend time with me or something like that. And so that was a challenge too. And, I tried to navigate through therapy the best I could as a kid.
Who I'm so sorry, but I'm gonna forget if I don't ask. Whose idea was it for you to get therapy?
It was my mom's. I think that she was a professor of special education at San Jose State. So she taught aspiring teachers how to teach children with disabilities.
Mm.
And she's taken she took a fascination to child development. And so I don't know exactly why I had such an early involvement with therapy, but that was there. You know, I remember being a kid and playing in sort of a sandbox like type, what would you call it? A sandbox with a therapist when I was very young.
Mm.
And I think that as I developed these feelings of unworthiness, that was one of the reasons why I kind of continued to see therapists off and on throughout my life. And I hadn't really found one that I developed a really healthy healing connection with until quite recently, actually. So that's just a testament, at least for me, that, you know, finding a really great therapist can be a process and a challenge and can take a long time, but it can help. And I'll get to that a little bit later on. Um, so yeah, that's sort of the synopsis of my childhood experience, like up until high school. I mean, there's more there, but
Mm.
uh, do you, I mean, what are what's some of your experience with like what you went through pertaining to difficulties in childhood and potential things that maybe you use some form of escapism to run away from?
A good question. First of all, thanks for disclosing all of that. I'll try to be careful and let you to be the one to disclose anything. Um, yeah, I mean, I think the thing you're explaining, of course, it's unique to you, and the particulars are all completely unique to you. But I don't think that phenomenon is so unusual. You know, the idea that even somebody from a home that's well-to-do in terms of first order needs could possibly have such an existential worry that's so constant and runs through so much of life. And I had that too. Um, Let me see if how I want to do this. Well, okay, I'll tell you about my experience because that was your question, and then I'll get to something that I'm interested in that I think could be troubling if we don't get a grasp on. So I had a similar experience. My parents were married and still are married, and so I didn't have the competing nature of two different families, I guess. But I did have this. I've always been a deep thinker. I've always been what motivates me in terms of thinking or education or knowledge has always been deeply both philosophical and creative, I guess. And I'm always looking for solutions to a different problem than everybody else is. You know, just as an example, I've always been really into like independent films. And I remember in a freshman year of high school, and I was looking for like the meaning behind them and what people may have meant to portray and what I may have done in that film if I wanted to portray this thing. My mind would drift that way, and we were supposed to be answering these questions. You know, how do you think he used lighting in this film, or something like that? And you know, I'm going on to I forgot the question. I'm running on to all these different themes.
No, that's great. That's what I want to hear.
It's so it's just interesting. You think the way I describe the way that I think now, especially because I have a context to fit it all. You'd think, oh, what a boon! You know, teacher would be really happy to have those conversations. But I was easily labeled as distractible, and this is like early on. I mean, I'm talking like kindergarten age. I was labeled distractible, and I was just always explorative and interested, and perhaps not interested in what was salient in terms of what the teacher thought I should be focused on. So that was an easy label to put on me, like distractible, forgetful, obviously intelligent, but why isn't he trying at any of this stuff? So that was never, I try not to blame it on anybody, but if I were an educator to myself, I would imagine that I would nurture that part of my thinking and figure out how to make it make sense in terms of what people expect of me, so that I could open my eyes to that. But pretty early on, I caught these labels and trends, and turned out that my people in my peer group less and less wanted to be associated with me because I was seen as like I'm causing trouble. And my first sense of escapism was through humor. I guess that's just a temperamental thing. Like I would I would use either dark humor or dry humor. Sometimes I still do it all the time, or sarcasm, to get myself out of an uncomfortable situation that I couldn't quite understand, but I knew it was uncomfortable. And that became a trend, like this dark, weird, bad jokes, inappropriate jokes, kind of humor. I'm talking like primary school into secondary, and that caught me in trouble. But it got me some laughs, so I would have made it in like the Comedy Store or something, I guess. But so I leaned on that, and so I already sort of put on a face as this guy who didn't give a shit. This self-fulfilling in terms of I'm already told I don't care, and now I'm just like, not only do I not care, but I'm making jokes out of it. So I took on that identity. I said, fine, whatever, let's just do it. And in high school, I got into just a party scene, because that seemed to be a logical next step for me. So drinking, taking drugs, whatever. And then I, accumulated more labels. I would get in some legal trouble in secondary school, and that became, what started as just trying to figure out who I was in a peer group, or figure out who I was for myself, where I had a place in all this thing. I went too far in that direction, and it became my identity to be a counterculturalist or counter norm, or whatever you want to say. And I didn't know how to do it differently than that. I didn't know how to reevaluate myself and contextualize myself in a healthy way. And that was the competition I had for my self-identity versus my social identity, versus who I was to my parents at home, because I was obviously doing things that went against my own best judgment or my own best values. And I was juggling that all the time. And I was labeled as whole slew of mental disorders per the DSM, or developmental disorders, and labeled an addict, and so it went from there. It was very self-fulfilling, very, very unhelpful, and amazingly, it took, looking back on it as a story of my life, it would only be a short chapter to talk about how I jumped from seeming to have no good identity or self-awareness to having a very deep meaning and purpose, and it kind of clicked like that.
Thank you for sharing all of that with me. As really great story. And I'll throw in there too, I also in school was labeled as having these different learning disabilities, and kind of put in different classrooms. And I totally agree with what you were saying, that I think some of those labels and identities can and did become a self-fulfilling prophecy for a period of my life. And so I can definitely relate to, juggling school and identity with family dynamics too. And yeah, I'm right there with you.
But that is so, like, I wrote the book Outgrowing Addiction with common sense instead. Oh, wow. Thank you, man. With common sense instead of disease therapy. And I'll have to write a new one, because I don't know if I really harped on this quite enough, but that, the thing that you explained about your life and the thing I just explained is so freaking normal. That is so within the realm of natural, normal development, that I totally recoil when my colleagues are quick to put a label on something, even if they think it's in the service of helping that person. There's a guy named Ross Green, who I mentioned in the book. Ross Green's a child psychologist, I guess developmental psychologist. And he has a nice framework that I don't think goes far enough, but I think it's a nice step, where he discuss, and I lean on this a lot. He talks about, stop thinking about kids as who create some sort of challenge for you in school, or challenge for themselves, as people who are choosing not to do well, but think of them as people who would definitely do well if they could. Virtually everybody wants to do well, if they can. And perhaps if they're not, it's by virtue of lagging skills. So he says, let's break these up. What is, you as, let's say, a teacher or a parent, whatever, what are the difficulties that you're having with this child? And see if you can prioritize them into the top 3. And you prioritize them in the top 3, and you would say, all right, well, this child is having difficulty getting to class on time, or this child is having difficulty doing, expected chores, or whatever it is. And then you sort of relay this to the kid. It seems like you're having difficulty getting to class on time. What's going on? And tier one is like, there's no solution being generated. It's just a rule. Like, don't generate a solution after this conversation. Only listen and only drill down. It's like motivational interviewing, which we could get to, and try to figure out what the issue is. And once you've established what the issue is, it's like a handshake and saying, thank you for helping me understand. And on a different day or a different time, you can use that to say, hey, remember I said it seemed like you were having difficulty getting to class. And we agreed that, it's hard for you to get to class because, first of all, you don't get breakfast in the morning at your home, and you have to get it from the cafeteria, and often there are long lines. But the thing is, if you don't get to class on time, it disrupts me. I have to sort of stop the rest of the class, and it affects their learning. So I wonder how you could get the thing that you need. Breakfast is important. And in a way that also it doesn't affect the learners of my class. Can we establish a collaboration here? And you work with the kid to find out, generate a solution. That's not a compromise, but it's like, we both know that there are things that need to get done here. Can we work together? And so whatever the solution is, maybe it's like a teacher gives the kid permission to cut the line or something. I don't know what it is.
Cut the line.
Whatever it is. It's like, obviously this is a difficulty. So can I work out with the lunch staff that, can you have something ready to go? And so this kid can grab it and get to class. So maybe the onus isn't even on the kid. Mm-hmm. Anyway, you run down all of these problems like this using a max 3 at a time. You leave the rest on the back burner, saying like, things are just what they are. I can either handle it unilaterally as an educator if I need to, or just recognize that, we all have our difficulties, and I'm not going to hound you for this, but we'll work on our 3 collaborations. And if they're not going well, it doesn't mean that you're not trying. It means that something happened with our solution that's changed. I like that a lot. The reason I like it is because there's no need to place a label on a kid. There's no need to quickly jump to the assumption that there's a complex, there's something pathologically wrong. It's like, we're a community and we're working together, and we should work together to generate a solution. And people say, that takes too much time. But first of all, I think that's a time saver overall, if you can really connect with people. And I think that's what an educator's job really is. And most educators would agree. Second of all, even if a lot of people will say, well, labels are good because they give you a framework for what the person's dealing with, so that you can, you could hand that framework to another person and they would sort of understand too. I hate the idea of handing a framework to another person. I hate the idea that you have just a chart for being a human being that you pass on. That's sort of anti-community to me. It's so forced. And so I think that is an issue, early on and in adulthood, that people are subject to labels for what are actually very normal experiences, which is reflected in the rise of recorded mental illnesses or developmental disorders that we have now. So
I really love that framework and the way you so eloquently described it to me. I really liked in Dr. Peel's book, Outgrowing Addiction, there you talked about a child who was, I think they were having trouble with like creative writing, but they could draw these really great sort of and funny and engaging cartoons. And when you were talking about that, it brought that to mind, and how if we could approach each other as human beings with our own skills and traits and strengths and weaknesses, we can almost sort of collaborate instead of compete or demean, to incorporate a larger and more colorful and full picture, both inside and outside of the classroom.
Thank you for bringing that up. First of all, I still remember that kid, and that kid's an adult now, and still sends me pictures of new art that he creates, and I think it's really cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah, there was a guy that was like tagging buildings, and that was sort of his escapism. And I'm like, dude, I love those pictures of the buildings that you tagged. You might want to stay away from dark alleys, but that's not exactly pro-social. But dude, as your teacher, let me just tell you that I want those on paper if you're up for drawing them. And I don't think that's a pretty simple olive branch to extend to a kid.
Right.
It didn't take very much effort for me to say, you obviously have a talent. Yeah, I wonder how we can incorporate your talent. But you would be, or maybe you wouldn't be, so surprised at how infrequently people are able to do that. And there has to be, I don't know how, I don't want to get too abstract or too deep, but there has to be a way to incorporate people into your community. And if you've decided that there's a lever that you pull when people are just too difficult to incorporate that sends them down into the pit of someone else to deal with, you've lost. And I think that morale is going to suck. I think that the idea of preparing kids or people for this world and to deal with misfortunes is going to suck. And it gets into it might be a good segue now, because I think that gets into some of the complexities that you've also shared in your story. I would love for you to share more.
Absolutely. And just a quick sort of precursor, a placeholder that's going to come back later in the story. When I was around 10, I had the opportunity of going to either sort of a Christian youth camp or a circus camp run by an old hippie named Wavy Gravy, where, the kids slept in teepees, and there were all of these different skills that during the week that the kids were there, they could tap into. And so of course I chose the circus camp. And when I got there, I saw all of these different things that I could do. And then I saw the unicycle, and it was almost like a spiritual pull to this thing. And I was like, I'm going to learn that in this week. And by the time the week is over, I'm going to be able to ride without holding on to something and show my parents. And so I devoted 4 to 6 hours a day to learn this skill, and successfully was able to ride. And then shortly after, got a unicycle that I rode around Santa Cruz. And also one of my probably my earliest attachment was to adrenaline, specifically through roller coasters. And that was sort of that was my identity as a kid. I was like the roller coaster guy. You could say this theme park, and I would say it has this many roller coasters and they're all this tall, and I wanted to design them. So those, just as a quick sort of marker in my story, those were a couple of things that I was really attached to throughout my life and very passionate about, and actually still am, albeit in different sorts of ways. I actually would ride my unicycle around Santa Cruz when I was a kid, up until this car full of college kids or some group of people drove past me and threw an empty beer can at me and were like, "Get off the road, freak." And then I stopped. It was something that I just put down for over a decade, and thankfully picked up later. But I just wanted to throw that in there just so that the viewers and you kind of have an understanding of things that came into my life that will come back at the later part of my story. And so fast forward to high school, I started having this unhealthy relationship with cannabis in particular. I had a lot of unresolved pain from my past, and I didn't feel like I had anywhere to go with that pain. So I didn't really only just use cannabis all the time. I pretty much stopped going to school, and I tried to hide that, and I tried to run away from my parents, and just it did have really disastrous consequences in my life, because I didn't know how to talk about it, and I didn't know how to deal with it in a way that might facilitate some sort of connection. It would have been really great if I had that with my mom, at least one person, but I didn't really feel like I had it. And I was also kind of running with a certain crowd, and just not putting priorities into my education. And I'm just wondering, because you do consulting work with families and kids, among a variety of different avenues. Have you ever run into a similar situation where there's like a parent that has a certain idea of how they feel like their child should be behaving, and then they have the child who is going through something and might not know how to communicate that to their parents? And how have you navigated maybe coming to some sort of solution before what happened to me, which I'll get to. Yeah, I'm just curious about your thoughts about that.
I'm trying to think. It's interesting that what you just sprung to mind is that this happens all the time. Sort of a micromanaging is not exactly the best term, because it's just a parent being a parent, maybe having concerns that something's going on with this kid. I'm not quite sure what it is. Don't know if he knows exactly what it is, but I think he needs to do this. And so they have sort of a structure or template that they would like the child to follow. And the basis for asking me to work with them is, will you help me get my kid to follow this template? And so the best I can do there is, well, I try to be forthright that I would really like to work with him, and depending on what we would figure out, I'd like to know that too, that you have flexibility with your template. And people usually say yes to that. I can't remember a time where people have ever said, no, this needs to be it. And I try to stay vague that way. And as I build sort of a relationship and understanding of what that child is going through, I can reflect deeply enough with them that whatever I have permission to share with their parent or educator, whatever it is, I'm able to put into terms that I might want to put that issue into, if I wanted them to really hear it. You know what I mean? So a kid might say, I don't know. I guess it's too much for me to follow these rules because A, B, and C. So instead, screw it. I'm just going to do A, B, and C. I might say, reflect back to the parent. This is a kid who wants to do well by you, and his interests are this, this, and this. And he's really having trouble figuring out how to incorporate these interests the way that he really wants to incorporate them, and the way that he really wants to live them out into the fold of what is expected of him. And so it'd be nice for him to get a foot in the door and figure out how we might do that. Similar collaborative process I explained earlier with the student, but now it's more of a facilitation between a student and a teacher, or a kid and a parent. So I do run into that all the time. I mean, that's the bulk of what I run into, is that it's generally a communication issue. Yeah. So, and specifically with kids, because kids have it's interesting to work with adults, but there's an interesting element with kids that they are existing under the auspices of other people in whose care they're in. So, at school, it's under the auspices of their educators, and at home, it's of their parents. So, it's difficult for kids anyway to try to develop an identity and exactly how much they should be taking on their own, or how much they should be, listening to somebody else who's doing things for them. And that changes day by day, depending on how old you are. And so there's an element of just natural development and changing that happens too, that's interesting to deal with. And actually, I'll point people to there's a guy named Robert Schwabel. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He wrote a book called The 7 Challenges, and this is a developmental stage that he coined transference. And then he talks about where it's not exactly clear who has the self-agency here. Is it the kid who should be listening to a parent? Is it a parent who should be stepping back and letting the kid do more? Or how do we operate this? I hope that answered your question. That's like a million thoughts all at once.
No, absolutely. It did. And what it brought to mind for me is that it's all, at least from my experience with someone like a parental figure, like my mom, for example, it's almost like it can be like you're too close, like that my mom could see certain aspects of my being, but because we have this sort of, like you were just talking about, the dynamic of a parental relationship, I can't hear certain things coming from her, and she can't necessarily hear certain things coming from me. So having sort of a person in the middle that can have a little bit more distance in certain ways can help open our minds. I appreciate you sharing that with me. So what eventually happened pretty quickly was that a decision was made that I was going to be sent to what would be called a emotional growth wilderness program and a emotional growth boarding school. The wilderness program was in Utah, the boarding school came after the 2 months that I was in wilderness, and it was in Idaho. I I'm going to talk about this example because I feel like it's a cool sort of, it's a story of adaptability. And so when I got shipped away, I willingly got on the plane. Thankfully, I did not have, two what they're called escorts kind of burst into the house and pull the kid out of bed in the middle of the night and then ship them off to one of these places. I got on the plane willingly, but it was a complete, it was like throwing me into a unfamiliar country. I was used to these certain things. I was used to these social connections. I was used to technology. That was a big one. And I was plopped into the desert in the high desert in Utah in February with 3 feet of snow on the ground, and was told that I could not talk to anybody else in the group. The requirement there was that I couldn't talk to anyone in the group until I got these letters from each one of my parents. And what was contained in that first letter was a synopsis of why I was there, how my actions, my negative actions were impacting their life in a harmful way. And
what did you come up with? Like, I'm interested. This is interesting because this is like, even as a listener, I'm sure this escalated quickly.
Yes.
So, did you wake up one day unaware that you were being sent somewhere, and then all of a sudden it was in your face, well, you're going to be sent here. Then you had to willingly go. And what did you learn was the basis for your, being enrolled in these programs?
So it happened rather quickly. The whole process is usually that my parents communicated with each other that my behavior was unacceptable and impacting their life in a negative way. And then we all went to what's called an educational consultant, which is basically a guy who there was like a 3 or 4 hour meeting with my parents, and they probably got laid out a bunch of different options of different, schools and programs that I could be sent to. And then it was arranged. I got a plane ticket and flew out the next morning. So that happened really quickly. And as far as, it had been clear for the 3 months or so leading up to it that I was kind of spiraling down a really dark path very quickly. There were some, the really not going to school anymore was a big red flag. And there were a couple of times that I ran away from home and stayed with a friend and just kind of disappeared off the face of the earth. And there were definitely some issues with verbal aggression. I was combative a couple of times when my parents would try to take like my backpack away with my bong in it, and things like that, things of that nature. And it just reached a point, I think, to them where when I got that letter from my mom specifically at the wilderness program, one of the lines that really stuck out to me was, I refuse to allow you to take a shit on my life anymore. And that really hurt, because even through the difficulties that I was having with communication with specifically my mom over my usage of cannabis, she still was near and dear to my heart. I didn't want to impact her or really any of my parents' life in that way.
That's really powerful, man. And I had a very similar experience where it seemed like if you just put on a transcript or something, or a list of the things that I had done that seemed counter to what everybody else wanted of me, it seemed like I just didn't care. It sounds like it could have seemed like you just didn't care either. I'm giving up. I'm doing screw it all. I'm doing my own thing. But it meant something to you very deeply to hear that, your close family thought that you were somewhat intentionally being, manipulative or trying to destroy their lives. That cut deep, and I
Yes.
guess that's why it was so easy for me to pick up on the idea that people will do well when they want to. Just returning to that. So sorry
Yeah.
for interrupting. I just wanted to highlight that.
No, it's a great question. And yeah, so it was such a profound experience because on the one hand, I could, and I think that many, I've been in communication with many of my old friends who have gone through the same system, we're at the same program, and also just heard stories about other kids that were, now adults that went through that have just had horrific PTSD from the experience of going to these places.
Hmm.
I While I think that there are some very, very obvious flaws in that system, like I consider both programs I went to be what I would call like attack therapy cults.
Hmm.
Um, I had I understood right when I got there that the way that I was going to be able to get back home and re-engage with life the quickest was if I just kind of followed the rules and did the work. And I lo and behold, I got out sooner than what it was suggested to my parents that the time that I should be there. But specifically with wilderness, it was this really cool experience because I got there and I'm the newest one in the group. So I'm number 10, right? And the person that's been there the longest is number 1. And as I stayed the 2 months there, kids would leave and graduate, and I would go from number 10 to number 9 to number 8. And I was there at this really cool time of the year because it was from February to April. And so it was almost like this metaphor of change where as we would have to backpack 8 miles every day. And then there was usually some pretty intense like therapy around the campfire at night, and writing and everything else. But I saw the snow melt on the ground, and I went through this sort of withdrawal with like technology and the internet where I was like, I miss TV and I miss my computer and I miss my friends. And then something transitioned about midway through where I would wake up in the middle of the night and I would look at the stars, and it would just be this magnificent display of stars because we were out in the middle of nowhere. And I felt this immense peace, and I would look up at Orion and it would bring me this comfort. And I started to realize that actually all of these things that I thought that I needed were less relevant. And I started to embrace the experience of being in the wilderness and being with my group. And we were required to harvest sage we had to like use a knife to create a bow drill set, and we were not allowed to eat hot food until we could make a fire using that bow drill set, which took me 3 or 4 weeks while I was there to be able to create that and to learn the skills to do that. But then once I did, I got really good at it. I was making an ember in less than 30 seconds and then 20 seconds, and I was making fire. And by the time that I left, it was almost like, I don't know, I felt different. I felt like I had a knowledge that I can adapt to change and grow, even in a very, what might be considered traumatic situation. Anyway, I thought I would share that story with you because I feel like that's sort of a theme that if I look at my life through this lens that I'm looking at it now, I can really extract these teachings and a better understanding and sense of myself.
That's interesting. So there's this issue that I have with taking a compliment for the work that I do with kids.
Mm.
And the reason that I have this issue is because basically what I'm doing is just betting on the kid to develop and mature with possibly some help from me, but in the context of their own lives over time. And so people sometimes will say, wow, you've really done magic. And that peeves me because people develop these things anyway. I think the best thing that I do is point out when they've developed a different solution to the same problems that they've had before, and notice or try to get them to notice what how does this fit into the mold of your life better? I mean, is this a better solution, or is this approach a better solution? Is this realization that you've had something interesting versus this other possible realization that you've had? And what you just explained is that, you're pulled away to this environment that is, it's bad. I mean, if the word bad means anything, it's not a good idea to, I mean, even if the idea was, hey, maybe this person will develop a sense of, I don't need all of this material stuff while he's out here. I mean, they could say that. You can be totally honest about the idea that, our approach for, you could say, quote, our approach for you kids here is that, this is going to be tough, but you're going to find a community with all of these people. You're going to kind of hold each other up. And along the way, you're going to have these unintended sort of experiences, positive experiences. And when you have them, let's talk about them. No, the thing that you were was like, let's strip this kid out of bed, more or less, get them to a place, tear them down so we can build them back up and turn them into like a cog in a gear.
Yes.
And then they'll return as that cog and problem solved. So what you're describing is something that's interesting about things like AA or, the programs for troubled youth or whatever, or even in schools where there's an amount of credit that people give to a program itself for helping them develop along the way. Whereas on one hand, it's possible that those skills or ideas would have developed naturally over the course of time anyway. And on the other, it's possible that these programs even may have deterred or been a hindrance on the ability for this person to generate those experiences in other more healthful ways. So a lot of credit is often given to programs that really are just relying on something that happens over time.
Mm-hmm.
I do appreciate the sense that you drew out of it, that you had to, the point that you made, it's sort of in a different realm of what we're talking about, that the experience was kind of traumatic, but it gave you an assurance or a realization that no matter what kind of mindset that you're in and whatever environment you're in, you have the ability to look for a silver lining, which I think at the top of this conversation, you mentioned you wanted to talk a lot about silver linings. And the silver linings are something that that concept is something that you've clutched and has been helpful for you along the way.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree. And it's really, this is kind of tapping into the overall theme that we'll get into at the end. But I've done one thing that I really love about myself is I try to really look back at my life and have a great sense of like self-awareness, both of my skills and aspects of my being that like I want to work on. And I think in doing that, and through, I have a wonderful therapist who I rarely see anymore. I mean, that person is there if I need them, but they have helped me immensely with just this healing. And in doing this healing, I can look back at these experiences with a new lens and a new framework. And I can see the challenges and how difficult they were. But I also see that there's a lesson there. There is what I call, I don't like to use the word trauma for myself anymore. I like to use the word like sacred teachings. Like there's something that I've learned through going through the issues in my childhood, and where we're at kind of now in the story is these troubled teen industry circumstances, which are, and that the thing is that like I kind of feel like I got out of it without as much damage as I've seen some kids have. I thought that after the 2 months that I was in wilderness, that I was going to just be going back home. And lo and behold, during graduation, I was told that I would be moving on to one of these schools. The company doesn't exist anymore, but it was called CEDU, CEDU. And it was very much like what I saw there, that some of the behaviors that some of the staff had to the kids was just horrific. And it was very much a sort of pyramid-like hierarchical structure where there were different phases, and when the kids were down here, the kids who were up here and had been there longer could have a certain power over them. And they had these groups where all the chairs would be in a circle, and they would encourage the kids to like get up and sit across from the person they're trying to attack or have some sort of gripe with, and the staff would kind of circle around the circle of chairs like vultures. And it really felt to me like the purpose was to try to break these kids down and make them cry, and from there they could kind of latch in and state their opinion on what they're going through. And like I said, when I was there, I was like, I want to get out of here as quickly as possible, so I'm going to kind of just blend in and not make waves, because they have all of these consequences for very trivial things. So, if your shirt's not tucked in, then, there's a consequence attached to that, all the way up to, did you hold hands with a woman, or did you sneak a CD player in? And the consequences could range all the way up to being isolated and being on what's called bans, where you literally, if someone tries to approach you to talk to you, you have to say bans and you can't speak to them. It's just really, really twisted. But and thankfully I got out of that, and I can see that, and I can see that actually I made some really great friends that are still my friends to this day from being there, that I wouldn't have known if I hadn't gone through that process. But I don't want to try to sugarcoat and deny that these types of programs can have absolutely horrific effects on kids that turn into adults later on in life. So that's kind of a synopsis of my experience there. But because I was only there 10 months, and they tried to get my parents to pay for the whole 2 years. That was the length of the program. And ironically, about a month after the 10 months was over and I left, Sea-Doo went bankrupt. They had like embezzled all of the parents' money that had paid for the 2 years, and they went out of business. So it was tricky, and I'm glad that I got out of that when I did. But it definitely, I find it fascinating that you do what you do, and so I've kind of wondered if maybe your ability to be that go-between between parents and kids ultimately might have saved some kids from being sent to places like that. I don't know. That's just